The first scream didn't come from a patient, it came from the intern locker room. A burst of laughter ricocheted off metal doors and tile, raw and unfiltered, as if the walls themselves were used to absorbing humiliation. Mateo Alvarez stood in front of his open locker, tying the drawstring of his scrub pants with deliberate, almost ceremonial care while the sound swelled behind him like a wave he refused to turn and face. They weren't laughing with him. They never did. The video playing on someone's phone was on full volume, some hospital meme about silent interns who freeze in code situations. And someone had decided it was the perfect time to compare it to how Alvarez just stood there yesterday, like a statue with a stethoscope. A scrub cap sailed across the room and landed by his feet. Someone imitated his slow, careful way of presenting patients. Another mimicked his accent, rounding his R's and flattening his vowels, stretching his silence into a punk line. Mateo finished tying the knot, closed his locker with a soft, controlled push, and inhaled through his nose until the edges of his vision steadied. He could smell the faint mixture of detergent and antiseptic from his freshly laundered white coat hanging inside, a smell that still felt new, still felt halfway between achievement and imposture. He slid his arms into the sleeves of the coat with the same precision he used to apply sterile gloves. Each motion small, measured, almost ritualistic. He traced his name badge with his thumb, Alvarez, MD, Internal Medicine Resident PGY-1, and for a moment his gaze lingered on the tiny, almost invisible crease in the plastic where another badge had once rested, a different ID with a different uniform and a different title. That one was locked in a drawer in his apartment 3 bus rides away, beneath neatly folded t-shirts, pressed into the quiet like a secret that could still smell of sand and gun all if you held it too close to your face. Someone brushed past him hard enough to bump his shoulder and mutter "excuse you," silent mode, and more laughter burst like a shaken soda can. Mateo didn't look up. He checked the time, 6:58, sign out into minutes, and stepped out of the locker room as if he were stepping across an invisible line no one else could see. The corridor outside was already awake in the brutal, fluorescent way hospitals woke up. Carts squeaked. A night nurse with hollow eyes pushed in for pole that rattled like cutlery in a drawer. A portable X-ray machine rolled slowly toward the ICU, led by a tech with a paper cup of coffee balanced precariously on top. Overhead, an automated voice announced that visiting hours were over, as if grief and worrying could be dismissed by schedule. Mateo walked toward the resident's workroom, his steps quiet, his posture straight, his face carefully neutral. To most people, he looked like what everyone said he was, the quiet intern who spoke only when spoken to, who rarely volunteered in rounds, whose answers came clipped and precise but were never wrapped in the easy, confident humor that made attendings nod and nurse practitioners smile. Only his hands betrayed something else, hands that were never clumsy, never rushed, moving with a steadiness that did not belong to someone living their first months on the wards. In the workroom, the air was thick with worn-out coffee and the sour remains of a long night. Computer screens glowed with labs, telemetry strips, and radiology reports. The night team sat hunched over the central desk, their voices low, their faces sagging but wired from adrenaline. Dr. Noah Green, the senior resident on nights, looked up when Mateo walked in, a half-smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "Alvarez," he said, stretching his neck until it cracked, "you ready to grace us with some words today, or are we doing telepathy again?" One of the other interns chuckled, and someone behind a laptop muttered, "He talks more to the EHR than to actual people." The room buzzed with that particular kind of cruelty that pretends to be harmless, wrapped in sarcasm, disguised as just joking. Mateo pulled out a torn notebook from his pocket, its edges softened by use. He placed it on the counter, flipped it open, and scanned his own compact handwriting. Every patient from the night before was listed with bullet points that weren't flashy but were thorough. Vitals, labs, changes in exam, nursing concerns written in careful, respectful detail. He looked up at Noah, met his eyes once, briefly, as if to signal he was ready, then glanced back at the notebook. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear, with no wasted syllables. He presented the first patient, an elderly man in pneumonia with worsening oxygenation, without stumbling, without theatrics, each phrase carrying the weight of someone used to saying only what mattered. Noah nodded slowly, the smirk fading as the efficiency of the report became impossible to joke away. Yet when Mateo finished, someone still muttered, "See, robot mode," and the room chuckled again, lighter this time, but still sharp. During sign-out, the attending for the day, Dr. Elise Park, the kind of doctor who moves through the hospital as if she'd been born between its walls, listened with her arms crossed, head tilted slightly. Her eyes, sharper than any scalpel, moved quickly from face to face, pausing when the laughter drifted over Mateo's head like a cloud of flies. She didn't say anything then, just watched the way he stood a little apart from the others, notebook held like a shield, shoulders squared not in defensiveness but in containment. Elise had seen interns crumble under far less. She had seen them talk quickly to hide their fear, chatter to cover their ignorance, make jokes to survive the shame of not knowing. Mateo was different. He didn't hide inside words. He hid inside silence. There was something disciplined about it, something that did not fit the pattern of the typical overwhelmed intern. The morning unfurled in its usual organized chaos. A rapid response in room 614, 3 families waiting for updates in the hallway, a diabetic patient refusing insulin, a confused elderly woman trying to climb out of bed, convinced she was late for work at a factory that had closed 20 years ago. Mateo moved through it all like a shadow attached to the team, always one step behind the senior, always in line with the marching order. On rounds, when the group clustered at the foot of each bed like a moving council deciding fates, he stood at the edge, eyes tracing monitors, hands hovering near the chart. When called on, he answered succinctly, never guessing, never embellishing. If he didn't know, he said quietly that he would look it up. Some attendings appreciated the honesty. Others took it as further evidence that he lacked initiative. The mockery followed him, thin as smoke. Careful, Alvarez might actually say a sentence with more than 5 words today, one resident joked in the elevator. A scrub nurse snorted, maybe he's in witness protection. Maybe if he talks too much his cover's blown. Someone from anesthesia whispered loudly enough for half the pre-op bay to hear. I'll believe he went to med school when I hear him interrupt someone. The jokes slid off his expression, but they did not bounce off untouched. They landed somewhere inside, in that locked storage room where he already kept faces and names he did not talk about, a room crowded with ghosts who did not care about hospital memes. At 11:38, Thea called a trauma code. A multi-car collision on the highway had sent a wave of patients into the emergency department. The overhead speakers crackled with the alert, and the mood of the hospital shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence, monitors beeped with renewed urgency. Sneakers squeaked harder against the floor as people moved faster, narrower, like the hospital itself was inhaling sharply. Alvarez, you're with me, Elise said, already walking toward the back elevators. There was no time for him to nod. He just followed, his notebook shoved into his pocket, his stethoscope already around his neck, fingers curling and uncurling once as they waited for the doors to open. The elevator ride was short but heavy. Elise tapped her badge against her thigh, her jaw set. She shot him a quick glance. You okay with trauma? She asked, the question more clinical than kind. He felt a flicker, a tiny rearrangement in his chest. For a fraction of a second, the mirrored elevator doors held not his reflection in light blue scrubs but a different image, desert wind pushing hot dust into his eyes, a gutted Humvee on its side, the metallic howl of a helicopter overhead. He blinked once, deliberately, and the hospital's fluorescent glare took the space back. Yes, he answered, and though the word was simple, it carried a density she noticed. It was not the yes of someone naive to trauma. It was the yes of someone who had known it long before this hospital had learned his name. In the trauma bay, chaos was choreographed by habit. A young woman with blood matted in her hair lay on a gurney, cervical collar in place, an EMT shouting vitals. Another bay held a middle-aged man with a shattered femur, groaning through gritted teeth. Nurses darted in and out, hanging fluids, drawing labs, calling out numbers. The air buzzed with adrenaline and the sterile, almost sweet scent of antiseptic. Elise slipped seamlessly into control, barking orders that weren't cruel but left no room for hesitation. Alvarez, you're with Bay 2, ABC's first. Call out what you see. She pointed with her chin toward a young man on a stretcher, maybe mid-20s, face pale beneath smeared road dust, his t-shirt cut open, a spreading bruise on his left side like an ink spill. As Mateo stepped up to the stretcher, the noise narrowed. His breathing slowed. His vision tightened not with panic but with the focus of someone who had been here before. in different tents, with different flags, under different skies. He placed his hands on the patient's chest with a gentleness that surprised the respiratory therapist beside him. "Airway patent," he announced, voice steady, louder than anyone in the locker room had ever heard it. His fingertips felt the rise and fall of ribs, the resistance of injured tissue. Breathing shallow, decreased movement on the left, his mind translated sounds into images, the faint crackle of air where it shouldn't be, the subtle lag of one side of the chest. "Possible hemothorax or pneumothorax," he said, already listening with his stethoscope, catching the absence of breath sounds exactly where he suspected. Circulation BP 90/60ths, pulse 120, cool extremities. Likely hypovolemic. He didn't think about whether he should speak. He simply did, each phrase another piece of a rapidly forming picture. Elise looked up sharply from the adjacent bay when she heard his tone. There was no uncertainty in it, no searching for approval. It was concise, almost clipped, yet layered with a clinical confidence that didn't match the shy, quiet intern she saw on rounds. "Good," she called out. "Get that chest x-ray stat. Type and cross. 2 units on hold. Start fluids, wide open for now. The trauma surgeon on call, Dr. Whitaker, swept in with his usual swagger, catching the tail end of Mateo's assessment. "Who's running this, Park? Thought you said this one was still figuring out how to use his pager." The joke earned a few smirks, but Whitaker's hands moved fast, pushing into the young man's side, eyes narrowing as he read the subtle signs of internal chaos. Minutes thickened. The monitor beeped in anxious patterns. The chest x-ray arrived, revealing a dark, ominous pooling that meant the young man was bleeding where no one could see. Orders flew, a chest tube was slammed in, blood surged into the collection chamber. Through it all, Mateo's hands didn't tremble. When the nurse fumbled with the chest tube tray, he steadied it without comment. When the anesthesiologist requested a dose, he had already drawn it up. When the EMT's voice broke while giving more details, he quietly finished the sentence for him without looking up, as if giving the man permission to breathe. Only one person truly saw it. Elise watched from the foot of the bed while Whitaker worked, her eyes flickering between the wound, the monitor, and Mateo. She noticed how he anticipated needs before they were voiced, how his gaze tracked the patient's skin tone and chest rise more than the monitor, how he adjusted the oxygen mask with the care of someone who had once held a stranger's life between two fingers and refused to let go. She saw the way his jaw tightened not with fear but with something older, deeper, a recognition that this was not new ground for him, only a new floor, a new language, a new badge. As the trauma stabilized enough for the patient to be wheeled toward the OR, Whitaker clapped Elise on the shoulder, exhaling hard. "Good save," he said, already turning away. He didn't look at Mateo when he added, "Your kid didn't freeze. Guess he's not entirely useless." The words were meant as a rough compliment, but they landed like a crumb tossed from a table. The rest of the staff began peeling away, the energy in the room decompressing all at once. The noise spilled back in from the hallway, more patients, more alarms, more normal. Mateo stepped back, pulled off his blood-speckled gloves, and looked down at his hands. The skin beneath the latex was flushed, the nail beds pale. For a brief, disorienting moment, he saw them as they had been years before, stained with dust, smeared with someone else's blood under a different light, wearing a different title clipped to his chest. He heard a distant thud, not of a gurney hitting a doorframe but of artillery in the distance. His heart stuttered, not with panic but with a strange, aching nostalgia for the version of himself who had moved through those other trauma bays with no one doubting his voice. "Alvarez," Elise's voice cut through the echo, clear and calm. He looked up, her gaze held his like a hand on the shoulder, firm and intentional. "You did good," she said simply, no embellishment, no theatrics. "You saw the chest before the film did." Not many interns do that. Around them, people were already moving on, pulling curtains, wiping surfaces, resetting the stage for the next emergency. The compliment hung between them like something fragile and unexpected. He swallowed, the instinct to deflect rising automatically. The old training whispered that praise was dangerous, that standing out drew attention, and attention could rip open carefully sealed doors. "Just followed the algorithm," he answered, voice softer now, but Elise didn't buy it. There was nothing algorithmic about the way he had moved, the way his hands had known where to go before instructions landed. She hesitated, then asked the question everyone else avoided because it would kill the joke if the answer wasn't funny. Where did you train before med school, Mateo? The question seemed innocent. It wasn't. It was a hand reaching toward that locked drawer in his apartment, those folded t-shirts, that other badge with the rank instead of MD. For an instant, the safe, rehearsed answer sat like a stone on his tongue. A generic reply about working as an EMT, about volunteering, about a vague overseas experience. But underneath it, something shifted, a flicker of anger at the laughter, at the way they had turned his silence into a caricature without ever asking why he carried it. He opened his mouth, the old habit of concealment and the new possibility of honesty colliding in his chest. Before either could win, a pager shrieked against his hip, almost violently loud. He flinched, hand flying to silence it. The tiny screen flashed an unfamiliar number, a code he didn't recognize, followed by a terse message: "Call immediately. Priority. Admin." Elise's pager buzzed at the same time. She glanced at hers and frowned. The same number, the same code. A cluster of administrative staff began appearing at the entrance, faces tight, eyes scanning the room with a kind of searching urgency that didn't belong to spilled coffee or late discharge summaries. One of them, a woman from the hospital's executive floor who never came down without a reason, spotted Elise and headed straight toward her, heels clicking like punctuation marks. "Dr. Park," she said, slightly out of breath, before turning her gaze to Mateo. It lingered for a second too long, like she was confirming something. "We've just received a call from Washington. They asked for you by name." Her eyes settled fully on him now. And for him. The trauma-based noise seemed to recede, not because it actually got quieter, but because the words were heavy enough to muffle everything around them. Mateo felt the air thicken, the faint, invisible tug of a world he had tried to bury pulling at the edges of his new life. Washington did not mean tourism in his vocabulary. It meant command. It meant hierarchy. It meant someone, somewhere, had opened a file with his old name in it. The administrator lowered her voice, though every syllable still felt like it echoed. "The call is from the Office of the Surgeon General," she said, her expression a complicated blend of curiosity and respect she had never shown him before. "They specifically requested to speak with Major Alvarez." The title landed like a forgotten nickname called out in a crowded room. For a heartbeat, the hospital fell away, and Mateo was back under a different set of fluorescent lights, in a briefing room that smelled of sweat and paper, a uniform pressing against his shoulders, a rank stitched over his heart. The laughter from the locker room, the jokes about silent mode, the dismissive comments in the elevator, all of it seemed to shrink, suddenly flimsy against the echo of that word. Major. He had spent months making sure no one here ever heard it. They walked to administration in a silence that wasn't empty. It was dense, like a room filled with unsaid things. The corridor felt narrower, the fluorescent lights harsher, every step echoing a little too loudly against the polished floor. Nurses and residents parted as they passed, some glancing at Elise with the respect reserved for attendings, others frowning slightly at Mateo, as if trying to compute why an intern with a still new badge was walking in lockstep with the days attending toward the part of the hospital where decisions were made, not simply followed. Mateo kept his gaze fixed ahead, but inside, it was chaos. His mind cataloged details automatically: the water stain on the ceiling tile by the stairwell, the squeak in the third-floor linoleum, the way his pulse had climbed from a steady 72 to something tighter, faster, without any external exertion. The hospital hallway blurred with the memory of another one, concrete instead of tile, the air hot and dry instead of cold and conditioned, the call there not from administration but from command, always heralded by that same feeling: something is about to change, whether you're ready or not. In the small conference room off the administrative wing, they were met with a laptop already open on the oval table, a video call waiting in the frozen still of a paused camera icon. A hospital administrator hovered by the door, his tie slightly crooked, his smile strained with curiosity he tried and failed to hide. "They're on hold, just waiting for you," he said, his eyes flicking between Elise and Mateo like he was trying to understand the hierarchy here and failing. You need anything? Water, coffee?" Elise shook her head once. Mateo muttered a quiet no, thank you, the words automatic, polite, at odds with the static building in his chest. The administrator nodded too many times and slipped out, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt much louder than it was. For a moment, the room held its breath, The laptop screen glowed with the sterile interface of a secure government call. Elise leaned against the back of a chair instead of sitting, her arms loosely crossed, her face unreadable in that way good clinicians perfected, open enough to invite truth, guarded enough to process it. She tilted her head toward him slightly. "Major," she said, the single word an invitation to explain, but not yet a demand. Mateo's mouth was dry. He could feel the weight of the old title pressing against the newer one printed on his badge, the two identities colliding in a space that was suddenly too small. He could have lied. The thought flickered across his mind like a spark, brief and tempting. He could have said it was a mistake, a misprint, a mix-up with someone else who shared his last name. He could have brushed it off as a relic from a short-lived enlistment, something clerical rather than substantive. But the truth was stitched into him as firmly as any rank insignia had ever been. The habits wouldn't let him disown it. "I was in the army," he said, his voice low but steady. "Medical corps, before med school." He didn't add the rank. He didn't have to. It was already in the room with them. Elise's eyes narrowed, but not with suspicion, with recalibration, like someone realizing the map they'd been using had been missing half the terrain. She nodded once, filing the information away not as gossip but as data she had needed all along to understand the person standing in front of her. With a small, almost resigned exhale, Mateo stepped closer to the laptop and clicked the blinking icon. The screen shifted, then resolved into the image of a woman in a tailored uniform, ribbons and insignia lining her chest in measured rows. Her hair was pulled back, her gaze direct, the background behind her generic enough to be any secure office in Washington. She didn't look like someone who made casual calls to community hospitals before noon. She looked like someone who had been briefed thoroughly before using anyone's first name. "Good morning," she said, voice clear through the speakers. "Is this St. Catherine's General?" Elise straightened instinctively, giving her name and role with crisp efficiency, then stepping slightly aside so the camera framed Mateo more clearly. The woman on the screen looked at him, and in that pause, an entire history passed through her eyes. Recognition, yes, but also something heavier, like a memory resurfacing after being deliberately submerged. "It's been a long time, Major Alvarez," she said, and the way she said Major wasn't performative. It wasn't ceremonial, it was personal. "You look different without the uniform." The room seemed to tilt just a few degrees. Elise didn't move, but he could feel her attention sharpen. Mateo swallowed once, his throat tight, his instinct to stand at attention warring with the reality that he was in hospital scrubs, not fatigues. "Ma'am," he answered, the word slipping out before he could choose a more civilian greeting. It was muscle memory, a reflex carved into him by years of training and loss. She introduced herself briefly, not as a stranger but as someone whose name he already knew from a distance. Surgeon General Lucia Benton, the nation's top public health officer, now looking at him through a glowing screen while the hum of the hospital's HVAC filled the pauses between words. "I'll be direct," she said, not unkindly. "This is not a disciplinary call. You're not in any sort of trouble." The relief that should have followed didn't fully arrive. Instead, it left room for a different tension, curiosity, wariness, the sensation of being seen by someone who had access not just to his public record, but to the classified parts too. She referred to a report filed years ago, a series of after-action notes from a field hospital that no longer existed on any map, where a mass casualty incident had nearly wiped out two entire units if not for rapid, decisive intervention by then Captain, later Major, Mateo J. Alvarez. She spoke of a protocol he had improvised under fire, a way of triaging limited blood supplies during prolonged engagement that had later been polished, formalized, quietly circulated through certain corners of the military medical world as Alvarez's ladder, even though his name never appeared on any published guideline. She mentioned casualty numbers that had been lower than anyone had predicted, and how those numbers had crossed her desk annotated with red ink and underlined phrases like unusual adaptability and exceptional composure under sustained threat. As she spoke, scenes he had spent years cataloging into a box in his mind came unlatched. Sand whipping against tarps, the metallic smell of blood mixing with the sharp burn of burning fuel, the crack of outgoing fire in the distance, the way a single lantern had cast long shadows over stretchers lined up in a tent that felt too small for that much suffering. He remembered tying tourniquets with hands that refused to shake, ordering everyone to shut up unless their words directly affected the living or the dying, improvising triage when supply crates didn't match the manifest. He remembered the way one of the surgeons had stared at him afterward and said, in a voice hoarse from shouting, "You realize you just saved 20 people by refusing to follow the textbook, right?" He had shrugged then, wiped someone else's blood from his neck, and gone back to the next task because there was always a next task. Now, years later, someone was reciting those moments back to him like a citation he'd never attended. "One of your former commanding officers forwarded those reports to my office last month," Benton said. "We've been reviewing outcomes from that deployment, looking for lessons that might translate to civilian mass casualty response. Your name came up more than once, not in headlines. In the margins, where the real work lives." There was no awe in her voice, just the same measured respect he'd heard occasionally in the desert when someone realized their life had hinged on a decision he'd made while the rest of the world slept. He stood there, caught between wanting to disappear and wanting, absurdly, to correct the small inaccuracies of memory that time always introduced. Elise remained silent, but the curve of her shoulders had changed. She was no longer just supervising an intern, she was bearing witness to the revelation that the quiet man the residents mocked for not speaking up had once been the person everyone in a tent looked at when the world outside was collapsing. The actual reason for the call, when it came, was threaded through with policy and urgency. Benton explained that the Department of Defense and the Public Health Service were collaborating on a new training initiative aimed at bridging combat trauma experience with domestic emergency preparedness. War had taught brutal, efficient lessons that could mean the difference between a hospital bending and breaking under sudden mass casualties, lessons few civilians had lived with in the same way. They needed clinicians who could speak both languages, war and ward, field hospital and teaching hospital, triage tent and ICU. "Most of the people we've identified are still active duty," she said. "Or they're career academics who consult from a safe distance. You're different. You're in the thick of everyday medicine now. You understand how these protocols look on the ground in a place like St. Catherine's." He heard the subtext clearly. You escaped, you tried to build a quieter life, but the skills you carry shouldn't stay locked away in your chest like shrapnel. "We're inviting you to join a working group," she continued. "Not full-time, a limited appointment. You'd remain here, continue your residency, but we'd ask you to consult, to help us translate what you did out there into something that can help civilians when the worst happens here." She paused, then added, more softly, "And before you ask, no, this isn't about sending you back. I know you've done more than your share of that." Behind the policy, there was something else in her eyes. He recognized it like a face seen in a crowd after years apart, the look of someone haunted not by what they'd done, but by what they knew and couldn't unknow. The sense of obligation that didn't retire just because the uniform did. She was offering him an opportunity, yes, but also laying a weight on the table and asking if he was willing to pick it up again. In the seconds that followed, his mind split into two tracks. On one, the pragmatic calculations raced, time away from his already punishing residency schedule, the risk of being resented by colleagues who already thought he was odd. The scrutiny that would follow if word got out that the Surgeon General herself had called an intern by rank instead of by hospital position. On the other, deeper track, images rose like ghosts. Young soldiers whose faces he remembered more clearly than some of his current patients. The rare families he'd met briefly before a transfer, the way their gratitude had felt almost heavier than their grief. The war hadn't left him, it had just moved into a quieter neighborhood in his head. Elise finally spoke, breaking the internal stalemate. Her voice was steady, but there was a new texture in it, a subtle protective edge. She asked about logistics, about time commitments, about how participation would interact with hospital policy regarding outside appointments. Benton answered each question with direct, bureaucratically precise terms, clearly anticipating resistance from overworked residency programs. As they talked, Mateo found himself pulled slightly out of his own looping thoughts, noticing how easily Elise stepped into the role of advocate even without fully understanding yet who, exactly, she was advocating for. When the practicalities had been laid out, the call shifted from logistics back to something more human. Benton looked at him again, her expression dropping some of the official polish. I still remember the first time your name crossed my desk, she said. The casualty list from that convoy 3 years ago. There was a note in the margin. Without Alvarez, multiply this by 2. I don't forget annotations like that, Major. People's lives live inside them. She leaned slightly closer to the camera, as if closing the distance. Whatever you decide, I want you to hear this at least once outside of a citation or a closed-door briefing. You did something extraordinary, and you have the right to carry that without shame. The word shame landed unexpectedly. It took him a moment to realize that part of the suffocating feeling that had followed him home wasn't just guilt for those he couldn't save. It was shame for having survived with skills forged in places most people here only knew from headlines. In the hospital, the jokes about his silence had become a way of shrinking him down to something manageable, something less threatening than the truth. Now, with a single sentence, she had cracked that shell. He didn't give her an answer on the call. He said he needed time to consider, that his duty here was heavy and he would not compromise patient care. She accepted that, set a date for a follow-up, and ended the call with a formal thanks that felt oddly intimate given the grid of pixels between them. When the screen went dark, the room felt suddenly too bright, too ordinary, as if it had snapped back into its original dimensions but his body hadn't caught up. Elise exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when you've just watched a bomb dismantled and realized at the last second that it was live all along. She didn't bombard him with questions. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, then spoke in the same tone she used with patients who had just received life-altering news. She pointed out, calmly, that whatever his past was, it was now unavoidably part of his present here, that sooner or later, people would find out, whether through formal announcements or whispered rumor, that he had a rare chance to tell the story himself before it was told for him, turned into some exaggerated legend or, worse, a joke built on fragments of truth. He nodded, but his stomach tightened. In the locker room this morning, they had laughed at him for being the quiet intern who froze. What would they do when they found out that the man they teased for not interrupting attendings had once commanded medics in a firefight? Would the cruelty vanish, replaced by awe that felt just as alien? Would they resent him more? Would every mistake he made now be measured against a mythical standard they thought his past obligated him to meet? As they walked back toward the clinical floors, the hospital felt slightly out of focus, like a TV with the contrast turned to high. A nurse passed them and gave Elise a questioning look. Elise simply said there had been a call from DC and kept moving. Mateo could feel curiosity crackling in the air already, invisible but unmistakable, like static before a storm. By the time he reached the resident workroom, someone had already heard that administration pulled Park and Alvarez out of the for some secret meeting and was spinning theories with the idle paranoia born of exhaustion and caffeine. He slipped into his usual spot by the computer, logged back into the electronic chart, and forced his hands to focus on mundane tasks, medication reconciliation, discharge summaries, follow-up appointments. The routine felt both grounding and absurd. It was bizarre to be deciding whether a patient needed a 5-day or 7-day course of antibiotics while his mind was still ringing with the phrase Office of the Surgeon General. Snatches of conversation floated around him half-heard, half-imagined. Maybe he screwed up that trauma and they chewed him out upstairs. Nah, Park wouldn't drag him into that. She owns her cases. You think it's visas? He's got that whole mystery immigrant vibe. The words pricked at him, but he didn't turn. He let them skim off, knowing that the truth, when it landed, would be so far from these guesses that they would have to rewrite their scripts entirely. It didn't take long for one of the more perceptive residents, a second-year named Priya, to notice the change in Elise's gaze when it drifted toward him during afternoon rounds. It wasn't the look of someone humoring a slow intern. It was the look of someone inventorying resources, suddenly aware that the quietest member of the team might be the one carrying tools no one else had. She couldn't know yet what Benton had said, but she picked up enough to sense that something had shifted, when a sudden deterioration on the telemetry floor sent the team rushing to another nearcode. She watched Mateo carefully. The same steadiness appeared, the same narrowing of focus, the same efficient choreography his hands had displayed in the trauma bay. This time, she saw it not as coincidence but as pattern. By evening sign out, the hospital hummed on into its familiar night cycle. Lights dimmed in some corridors, brightened in others. The smell of coffee grew sharper as the sun dipped. On paper, nothing about Mateo's status had changed. He was still an intern, still responsible for Scut, still the lowest rung on the official ladder. But inside him, the fault lines between who he had been and who he was trying to be had cracked open a little more. The laughter from that morning replayed in his mind, not as humiliation now, but as an almost surreal chorus against the memory of Benton's steady voice calling him Major through hospital Wi-Fi. As he finally sat for a brief moment alone in the stairwell, the only place he'd found in the building where the air felt even slightly private, he let his head fall back against the cool concrete wall. The hum of the building vibrated through his skull like a distant, constant engine. He stared up at the narrow strip of ceiling above him and realized that the question wasn't just whether he would join Benton's working group. It was whether he was ready to stop keeping his past and his present in separate, airtight compartments. Whether he could stand to walk into the locker room tomorrow, hear them crack another joke about his silence, and decide, finally, to open his mouth not with a sarcastic retort, but with the story they had never bothered to imagine. Because sooner or later, someone would connect the dots, the trauma performance, the sudden call from DC, the different way attendings had begun to look at him. And when they did, the quiet intern would no longer be a blank screen for their projections. He would be something far more complicated. The next morning began the way all hospital mornings begin, abruptly, mercilessly, with an alarm Mateo barely remembered setting. He rose before the sun, the air in his small apartment cold enough to turn his breath visible for a second as he exhaled. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, still tasting yesterday's adrenaline on the back of his tongue. His reflection looked unchanged, dark half-moons under his eyes, hair flattened on one side. The same stillness in his expression, but something beneath the surface felt rearranged, like a load-bearing wall inside him had been shifted without warning. He dressed in silence, the fabric of his scrubs whispering against skin that felt too alert, too aware of the weight the day would bring. When he pulled open the drawer where he kept his folded t-shirts, he hesitated. Beneath the cotton stack was the old badge, olive green, laminated edges worn, his rank and last name printed in bold lettering that once commanded rooms far harsher than any hospital corridor. His hand hovered over it but didn't touch. He closed the drawer softly and left the apartment before the thought could linger. At the hospital entrance, the automatic doors slid open with their usual whoosh, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Eyes lingered longer than usual, whispers dipped in volume when he passed. News traveled fast in medical buildings, carried on caffeine and boredom, accelerated by proximity and exhaustion. Someone must have seen Elise escort him upstairs yesterday. Someone must have overheard enough to turn curiosity into speculation. Hospitals were ecosystems built on rumor as much as on protocols. Mateo felt the scrutiny but kept his gaze straight, his pace steady, as if the marble floor were a rope bridge suspended over something dangerous. In the locker room, the laughter that had humiliated him hours earlier seemed to have been replaced by something else, an uneasy quiet, punctuated only by the metallic clank of lockers and the rustle of fabric. Two interns paused mid-conversation when he walked in, exchanging looks that weren't hostile, but weren't welcoming either. They watched him the way people watch a sealed box labeled fragile and classified at the same time. One offered a stiff nod, the other simply pretended to tie his shoe for too long. Mateo kept moving, opened his locker, and pulled out his white coat. He had thought the silence he carried inside him was armor. Now, it felt like a beacon. When he arrived in the workroom, the senior resident, Priya, looked up from her computer with an expression that hovered between curiosity and caution. She didn't ask anything, but her eyes lingered on him a little too long, as if searching for clues in the set of his jaw or the steadiness of his hands. Elise walked in moments later, crisp and alert, her hair pulled back tighter than usual. She gave a short greeting to the team, then looked directly at Mateo with a brief nod that meant more than the others could interpret. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't recognition. It was acknowledgement from someone who now knew enough to stop underestimating him. Rounds began in the usual controlled chaos, but something in the team's dynamic had shifted. When Mateo presented his first patient, his voice low and even, no one interrupted with jokes. No one sighed impatiently. The usual smirks were replaced by something bordering on restraint. Priya, who often corrected interns in a clipped tone sharpened by too little sleep, simply nodded and scribbled notes, letting his words settle without challenge. Even the medical student, who usually struggled to hide her frustration at his quiet demeanor, watched him with a faint frown of recalibration, as if she had been using the wrong diagnostic lens all along. Word spread quickly that administration had pulled him out of the trauma bay the day before. By noon, the story had mutated 3 times. Someone claimed he'd been reprimanded for stepping outside his role. Someone else whispered that he was being transferred. Another insisted he had connections in Washington who were checking on him. None of them came close to the truth, but the noise swirled anyway, building momentum in the hospital's invisible corridors of gossip. It followed him like shadowed footsteps. During lunch, a misnomer, more a hasty collection of bites between collapsing tasks, he sat alone at the edge of the break room. He didn't mind solitude. It was familiar, almost comforting. But today, the quiet felt charged. Across the room, Noah Green leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him with a narrowed, calculating gaze. Noah was the kind of resident who thrived on confidence, on volume, on sharp humor that sometimes cut too deep. He'd been one of the loudest voices mocking Mateo earlier in the week. Now, he pushed off the counter and walked over with the restless energy of someone who hated not knowing something. "What's going on with you, Alvarez?" he asked, his tone not loud but intrusive, the way someone taps a bruise to see if it hurts. "Park's acting weird. Admin pulled you in yesterday. There's some kind of issue." His voice danced around the last word, fishing for trouble. Mateo didn't look up immediately. He focused instead on the lines of his sandwich wrapper, the geometry of crumbs, the way silence could shape a space without effort. When he finally answered, his voice was even. "Nothing you need to worry about." The reply was simple, but it carried a firmness Noah wasn't expecting. The older resident's eyes flickered with annoyance, or maybe discomfort, difficult to tell. Noah opened his mouth to probe further, but Elise walked into the room at that exact moment, her presence slicing through the tension. Her gaze locked onto Mateo briefly before she moved on, and Noah stepped back as if she had physically intervened. The shift continued all afternoon. Nurses who had once dismissed him with casual impatience now paused when he spoke, as if reconsidering the weight of his instructions. A respiratory therapist he'd never met before asked if he had prior experience with ventilator triage, her tone respectful instead of skeptical. Even the attending covering cardiology that day, a notoriously brusque physician who rarely bothered to learn interns' names, asked him a question with a mildness that caught the rest of the team off guard. It was as if the hospital had recalibrated its gravitational field overnight, and everyone was trying to figure out where Mateo fit in the new orbit. But while the outside world shifted toward him, his inner world felt like a slow implosion. Every time someone looked at him differently, the drawer in his apartment seemed to crack open a little narrower inside his mind, letting light hit things he'd sealed away. Each respectful nod from a colleague reminded him of faces lined up on stretchers, eyes swollen with dust and pain, trusting him without hesitation. Each curious whisper in the hallway echoed with the unspoken fear that once people learned the truth, they would either elevate him into something he couldn't live up to, or distance themselves out of discomfort. He didn't want reverence. He didn't want mythology. He wanted to practice medicine without the ghost of a past life sitting in every room with him. Late in the afternoon, during a brief lull in patient care, he found himself alone in the supply closet, retrieving gloves and saline flushes. The familiar sterile smell grounded him for a moment, but only just. His hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of the impossible weight of being known. He leaned back against the shelves, eyes closed, letting the hum of the air vent fill his ears. In the desert, when the world was collapsing, he had been decisive, sharp, unyielding. Here, surrounded by clean floors and bright lights, he felt exposed in a way war had never managed to make him feel. Before he could steady his breathing, the door opened. Elise stepped inside, letting it close behind her with a quiet click. She didn't startle him. Something in him had already known she would seek him out eventually. She folded her arms, steadying him not with authority but with that rare blend of compassion and clarity reserved for moments when a doctor must also be a human being. She spoke softly, telling him she could sense the way the day had pressed against him. She reminded him that secrecy weighs differently than truth, not lighter, not heavier, just sharper. And she told him something he had not expected to hear, that whatever he decided to share or not share, she would support it, because surviving something extraordinary did not obligate him to narrate it for others. Her words steadied something inside him, but did not erase the conflict. He thanked her quietly, his voice caught between gratitude and restraint. And then, before either could say more, a knock sounded against the door, urgent, unpolished. Priya's voice came muffled from the other side, calling Elise to the hallway. A patient upstairs was crashing, and the team was mobilizing. Elise opened the door, calling back instructions, already sliding into the role of attending once more. She turned to Mateo before leaving, her gaze steady. "Come," she said simply. "We'll need you." And just like that, the moment collapsed back into motion. As they hurried down the corridor, the hospital surged around them in bright flashes of urgency. Nurses moved fast, alarms echoed. The world resumed its usual chaos. But beneath it all, Mateo could feel something inevitable approaching: a confrontation, a revelation, a breaking point. Not because he wanted it, but because the past had stopped knocking and begun to push. Tomorrow, he knew, would not be gentle. The code blue hit before anyone had time to finish a full sentence. The overhead speakers crackled with the room number, sharp and metallic, and the entire floor shifted in an instant. Elise quickened her pace until it became a near run, her white coat flaring behind her like a flag in fast wind. Mateo stayed close at her side, his steps longer, smoother, almost eerily controlled. Priya and two nurses were just ahead, pushing the crash cart, already snapping on gloves. The hallway blurred into streaks of movement and sound: bed alarms chiming, visitors pressed against walls, the echo of hurried footsteps layered over the steady hum of machines struggling to keep patients tethered to the present moment. When they reached the room, chaos was already unfurling. A man in his 60s lay slumped back against the bed frame, skin gray around the mouth, rhythm strips on the monitor jagged and erratic. A respiratory therapist wrestled with the mask seal while a nurse shouted vitals that dipped lower with each breath. The air felt thick, charged, carrying the metallic tang of anxiety that clung to hospital ceilings during near-death moments. Elise stepped in first, voice firm, but the room was fracturing too fast for anyone to find a steady center. The patient's chest hitched once, then fell in a stuttering collapse. Something in the space changed when Mateo crossed the threshold. It wasn't dramatic or visible. It was subtle, like a shift in gravity that only the body felt before the mind processed it. His expression didn't harden; if anything, it softened, but his posture aligned with a purpose that didn't come from medical school. It came from someplace older, carved by necessity. He assessed the room and began moving before instructions were fully formed, hands steady as stone. "Pull the bed flat," he said, his voice low but carrying. "We're losing perfusion." It wasn't a command, it was an inevitability stated aloud. Priya shot him a quick glance, eyes narrowing slightly at the certainty in his tone, but she followed without hesitation. The man's pulse faded under their fingertips. Elise called for compressions, and a nurse stepped forward with trembling hands. After 2 uneven attempts, Mateo gently shifted her aside, placing his palms over the patient's sternum. The moment his weight leaned in, the rhythm became perfect, firm, deep, consistent, unbroken. Not the frantic pounding of someone desperate. The purposeful force of someone who had done this too many times in places where no code team was coming. The patient's ribs shifted under the pressure, but the compressions remained precise. The room steadied around the cadence of his movements. Elise called for epinephrine, but even before she finished the syllable, Mateo had already reached for the syringe and handed it to her in a single seamless motion, like choreography he hadn't rehearsed in years but still remembered by instinct. Priya paused again, observing him in a way that held both awe and confusion. She had seen competent interns, she had seen brilliant ones, she had never seen someone fall into crisis leadership with the kind of quiet inevitability that suggested this was not learning, it was remembering. Minutes stretched, the patient's rhythm stuttered, fluttered, then disappeared again. A weak pulse flickered, then vanished like a match in wind. Elise ordered a shock and the room braced. The man's body jerked under the electricity, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a faint, stubborn line appeared on the monitor, slow, irregular, but there. No one spoke as the room's tempo eased, breaths sensing again, adrenaline retreating slowly. Nurses adjusted drips. Priya scribbled notes with shaking fingers. Elise exhaled in a long, steady stream, her shoulders lowering an inch. The patient's color improved from gray to dull pink, and a collective, silent relief passed among the team like a shared pulse. Mateo stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. Sweat dotted his forehead, but his expression remained composed, almost serene. His breathing was steady, not the breathing of someone who had just fought death, but of someone who knew its patterns too well to be startled by them. That was the moment everything shifted. Priya looked at him with a confusion that bordered on disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, and for once, hesitated. Elise caught the expression, then looked at Mateo with the faintest thrum of recognition in her eyes, a realization settling deeper. She placed a hand briefly on his arm, grounding them both in a gesture small enough to be missed, but meaningful enough to change the energy in the room. When they left, the hallway felt lighter in volume but heavier in pressure. Conversations rippled behind them, whispers mixed with the soft beep of monitors. A nurse leaned toward another, murmuring something with an expression of dawning understanding. A respiratory therapist glanced at Mateo as he passed, this time not with curiosity, but with respect. As they reached the end of the corridor, Noah appeared from the stairwell, out of breath, carrying a clipboard. He slowed when he saw them, his gaze falling sharply on Mateo. Something in the scene must have told him everything he needed to know: the sweat on Mateo's brow, Elise's posture near him, the faint echo of urgency still clinging to all three of them. "What happened up there?" he asked, trying and failing to sound casual. Priya answered with a tone that held none of its usual competitive edge. "He saved him," she said simply. "Not we, not the team, not Park. Him." Noah's expression hardened into something like shock. But beneath it was something else: quiet recalibration, the collapse of assumptions he'd carried for weeks. "Since when can you run a code like that?" he asked, voice too sharp to be neutral. Mateo didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. The rumor reached the residence lounge before they did. By the time they entered to finish charting, four interns fell silent mid-conversation. One of them, a medical student with wide eyes and an untied scrub cap, stared opally. Another whispered to his neighbor, too quietly for words to be distinct, but loud enough for the message to travel. The air crackled with unanswered questions, some fearful, some admiring, some simply stunned. He logged into his computer and began typing his note, but his fingers paused halfway through. He could feel Elise watching him from her desk nearby, her gaze thoughtful, almost protective. She waited until the room had thinned out, the clatter of keys and murmured chatter fading into low ambient noise. When only the two of them remained, she spoke quietly, not lifting her eyes from the chart in front of her. "You know this won't stay quiet much longer." He nodded, staring at the screen where his half-written sentence blinked patiently. "I know. They're going to ask," she continued, voice calm and low, "how an intern moves like someone who's been running trauma tents for a decade. They're going to want explanations. Some will be curious, some will be threatened. Some will turn you into a legend you can't possibly live up to." He swallowed, the words sinking into him like a truth he had tried to outrun. "I'm not looking for attention." "I know," she said, "but attention has already found you." They sat in long silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Beyond the lounge, the hospital pulsed with its usual rhythm: stretchers rolling, phones ringing, footsteps echoing like a tide coming in and out. Somewhere, a code blue was being called on another floor. Somewhere, a patient was waking up. Somewhere, a family was grieving. The world kept moving, indifferent to titles and secrets, and still something essential had shifted. When the sunset finally bled through the slats of the blinds, staining the walls with a deep orange glow, Mateo closed his chart and stood. His white coat felt heavier today, but it also felt more honest, as if it finally recognized the weight of both the man he had been and the one he was trying to become. On his way out, he passed Noah in the hallway. The older resident didn't joke, didn't smirk, didn't dismiss him. Instead, he stepped aside, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement stripped of sarcasm, a fragile truce. Outside the hospital, the evening air was cold, crisp, tinged with the faint scent of rain. Mateo stood for a moment beneath the flickering streetlight, breathing slowly, deeply, letting the day settle inside him. Cars hummed past, a siren moaned in the distance. The world felt enormous and intimate at the same time. He knew now that secrecy had its limits, that silence could protect, but also isolate. That sooner or later, the truth stops waiting and starts knocking down the doors you built around it. He didn't know yet what he would tell the hospital. He didn't know how he would explain the rank stitched into his history or the call from Washington that had appended the quiet life he'd tried to construct. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself a small exhale, not relief, not surrender, but acceptance. He was no longer just the quiet intern they mocked. He was no longer the officer he had once been. He was something in between, unfinished, unmasked, and undeniably present. When he finally turned toward the bus stop, his steps were measured, steady, almost peaceful. The night air pressed gently against him, carrying away the day's noise. Tomorrow, the questions would come. Tomorrow, the hospital would look at him differently. Tomorrow, the past and present would collide again. But tonight, just tonight, he walked with the rare clarity of someone who had stopped running from his own reflection.